So today I thought that I probably won't talk for very much and maybe take questions and do some questions and answers. So um, that's what I'll do. Often I start off by saying that talks are about happiness and daily living. That's all they're about, happiness and daily living, and that liberation, according to this teaching, liberation is a liberation from suffering, or the end of suffering. And what can we call the end of suffering? We can call the end of suffering peace of mind, because suffering is a disturbance of mind. And so when disturbance of mind subsides, it's like wind subsiding. So you go from storm or wind movement, disturbance, to stillness. So stillness is what is referred to as peace of mind. So peace of mind is the absence of suffering. And the absence of suffering means the dissolving of suffering, the falling away of suffering. And the problem can arise when we hear certain concepts. Our interpretation of what the concept means can be problematic sometimes. So we hear about the end of suffering, and we might then say, okay, this is what is available. Roger says the end of suffering is available in this life. It is a change that can happen. That's true. That's the description I put. It is a change that can happen. It is something which is available in this life. However, it may not be your destiny or my destiny for that to unfold. Now, so if we hear it's available, it is what liberation is, we may then say, okay, that's what I want. That's what I'm going to get. That's what I'm going to work towards, without keeping in mind that the whole point of the teaching is saying that peace of mind comes from the recognition that life is a happening, that life is unfolding according to God's will, which really means not your will. It's saying that this peace of mind sets in when there is a deep surrender, which means an internal shift that stops insisting on life being one way, i.e. stops insisting on life being the way that we want it to be. And there's a shift that accepts life being one way, i.e. the way that it is. So one of the realizations or explanations that can lead to a realization that allows for acceptance, especially acceptance of suffering, to kick in, is the explanation that provides us with reason to understand that suffering is normal, is expected, is valid. It's valid even in the face of the concept that says liberation is the end of suffering. If we are attached to liberation being the way life is, then the attachment to liberation basically makes suffering invalid. It means that psychologically, our relationship to suffering is going to be, that is invalid because that is the opposite of what I am attached to. So we need a description We need an explanation that makes sense, that allows us to relate to suffering when it arises in a way that is normalized, in a way that doesn't create resistance to the suffering. And I think one of the descriptions that can help us see this is the description that the human being, the human instrument, is on the one hand extremely evolved. There have been a lot of refinements and developments in evolution. If we look at evolution as the explanation for how we have got to where we are, and let's say that evolution is part of creation. Evolution is the mechanism of this creation of life. So if we look at it like that, we can see that the human being is extremely advanced compared to single-cell organisms. We have an immune system that is capable of closing up cuts, figuring out what entities in the biological system are not meant to be there, and coming up with a plan to get rid of them. So we have a brain that has such complexity to it to allow us to be intelligent and talk and learn. And so evolution has done an amazing job at developing life as a whole up to the stage it is now, including human life. And yet it hasn't sorted out a whole lot of things. It's a work in progress. So we can look at it like the developers have developed machines. They've come up with a technology, and let's look at the human being. So they've developed a human technology, but it still has some glitches in it, some bugs in it, some things that over time will evolve and change, and maybe certain bits will drop out. Certain functions or malfunctions will stop being there. But at this stage, those bugs haven't yet been ironed out. And so we are essentially machines that have glitches in them. And the glitch that I'm talking about is a type of functioning that happens simultaneous to the other functioning, which we would say is not the glitch. So we have the biological functioning, and mind you, even the biological functioning in some cases has glitches in it. So the hardware fails. Like some people have muscles that don't form, don't get strong, have bones that start to break down. There's all sorts of physical ailments, and so those physical ailments are because there's some glitch somewhere in the design. And another of the glitches is on the psychological level, where life is taken to be very personal, and what happens is seen to be something that the other has done that could have been different, and so then we blame the other, we blame ourselves. And from another perspective, we can see that attitude to life can fall away. And when that attitude to life falls away, it's described as seeing things more clearly. It's described as seeing life as it really is. And one way of putting that into words is seeing that life is much more impersonal, much more of an unfolding of a happening, that there aren't separate individual entities separate from life that have their own free will and autonomy separate from life. That's very important. doing things, but rather all these individuals that appear separate on one level are expressions and part of life. And so when seen from a wider perspective, then life is seen as this orchestra, this dance that is unfolding. And the good and the bad are seen to be part of the whole. And then the attitude to the diversity of life, to the inevitable tragedies as well as the wonderful things that happen. The attitude is one of inclusivity, of understanding, of seeing how that has to be life as it is now. And the alternative is seeing life unfold as it does now and being in resistance to it and saying, no, it shouldn't be like this. It should be pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. It should be perfect, perfect, perfect. And life hasn't been developed to be perfect, perfect, perfect. Life has been developed up to this point to be the way it is. It's a work in progress. And not to say that it's a work in progress and one day it will be perfect, 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 because it seems like inherent in the design of this life, at least relative to the individual that experiences life, there's always going to be things that are pleasurable and things that are painful. So it's a duality. Life, the flow of life, is a duality of pleasurable and painful, of things that we like, things that we don't like. There are interconnected opposites. Healthy babies and handicapped babies. There is wealth and there is poverty. There is hot and cold. So duality is essentially the nature of the flow of life. And so seeing it clearly is to see that life is, rather than life should be. And so the silence, the stillness that is referred to, is a stillness of the thinking mind. And the thinking mind is distinct from and different from the working mind. The working mind refers to thinking that is essentially functional in nature. Thinking about a circumstance and what needs to happen in order for the circumstance to be improved or for the next step in the process to happen. And functional thinking is very important for life to unfold. So we could have functional thought about what food we need to buy in order to have food for the next few days or the next week. We can have functional thoughts about travel plans and what needs to be put in place in order for that to happen. We can have functional thinking about projects that we need to find solutions to for things in the garden, watering systems, or business plans. All of that sort of thinking can be considered functional. The thinking mind is the part of our thinking that grabs hold of outcomes and turns them into something, relates to outcomes, especially outcomes that might happen in the future, or outcomes that have happened in the past, and relates to those outcomes as if they have a significant worth to who or what we are, or our happiness. So it essentially means that there is a relationship to outcomes that say those outcomes are very significant at defining, at creating, at adding to, or taking away from who I am. And that essentially is the false sense of self. It is an idea of who we are that includes in it that I will be more when I have gained more. I will be worth more, I will be more complete, and I will be happy when I have gained X, Y, and Z. I will be happy when life is one day pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And it may seem like a very reasonable and logical and accurate idea of ourself, because life has essentially grown us in such a way that that assumption is deeply ingrained. And it's deeply ingrained because it seems to be true. It seems to be that my happiness is dependent on whether people treat me well, whether I have more things than I had in the past, whether I have more creature comforts, more pleasure in life. And the reason why it feels like my happiness, which often we have a sense, I don't quite have it. I have a sense that things are not as good as they could be. And we feel as if one day this feeling on a deep internal level will come to see essentially that life only on the circumstantial level, life in relation to pleasure or pain, then our conclusion is, well, I will feel different when I have more pleasure and less pain. So it's the only variable that is obvious to us. Less pleasure means unhappiness. More pleasure means happiness is the conclusion, because that seems to be the only variable in the equation. And so that's when we need to start hearing. So life needs to start delivering information that says your happiness is not to be found in the flow of life. Your happiness is not dependent on pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. Your happiness is never to be found in the other. The other is essentially expression of either pleasure or pain. The other can deliver pleasure to you, or they can deliver pain to you. Your happiness, your sense of worth, your fulfillment, your contentment is never to be found in the other. It's just another way of saying your happiness is never to be found in pleasure or pain. And our assumption deep down is, I will be happy one day when life is pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. That means when the other loves me, when the other is kind to me, when everyone smiles at me, when no one acts in a way that delivers pain to me. And then we also say, when I function in a way that doesn't deliver pain, when I make all the right decisions. When I find the project that I'm meant to be working on, when I deliver outcomes that I can be proud of, that I can hang my hat on. You know, we think that one day when I've had a family, or when I've invented something, or written lots of books, or become successful and famous, then I can look back and say, these are the things I can hold on to. These are the things that when I currently feel depressed or unfulfilled, it's because I have none of those things to fill the void with. That might be the assumption that we have. You can ask any number of successful people whether their successes are what fill the void. And one of the consistent results is that successful or wealthy people will tell you that that isn't where happiness is to be found. You can have happy, successful, and happy, wealthy people, but it's not because of their success or their wealth, but rather because of their attitude towards life, and that attitude just happens to be accompanied by a circumstance that includes success and wealth. But there are multiple times as many wealthy and successful people that will tell you they are not happy. And that's because they have wealth, they have success, but their attitude towards life is an attitude of knowing themselves as the doer, as the one attached to outcomes. And when we know ourselves that way, we have a self-image. We are disconnected from our true nature. And it's that self-image that experiences life and experiences itself. And that self-image, because it's thought-based, and it's a thought-based idea of who we are that feels like it is lacking. And it feels like it's lacking because it's disconnected from its home, it's disconnected from its heart, it's disconnected from its essence. And it is our essence that delivers the fulfillment. So to the extent that there is a false self-image active in the system, that false self-image takes center stage. The false self-image prevents us from grounding into our essence, where our fulfillment is found. And so that false self-image becomes who we know ourselves as. And when life delivers circumstance that is painful, that self-image feels very personally attacked and feels very uncomfortable with life. It feels uncomfortable with itself and how it has acted in life. It feels uncomfortable with the other and how the other acts in life. And as this self-image is seen, and it gets seen as it gets described by teachings that say, the false self-image is an idea about yourself that includes the idea that you need to do this in order to be worthwhile, in order to be fulfilled. And then we might find that the working mind and awareness starts to see that movement, that psychological movement that is attached to outcomes. And when we see it, we go, wow, the description is correct. I live my life with the assumption that in the future, when this or that is delivered, then everything will feel okay. And as it's seen, there is a development in the complexity that is seen. There is an appreciation for how powerful ingrained beliefs can be and what effect they have on our experience of life, especially in terms of our comfortableness or uncomfortableness in life. And so suffering in practical terms arises in the form of guilt and blame and pride, all of which at their root have the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership at the root, meaning I am the doer, I am the creator, I am the one that is responsible for determining my actions, my thoughts, my speech, the way I behave, and therefore the outcomes in my life. And you are an autonomous, separate entity, just like I see myself as. And you are the one responsible for everything that happens through you. And so that self-identity that sees us as autonomous agents, the ones in control, the ones that choose of our own volition, that identity means that we are very quick to judge and to blame the other and to hold resentment and to hate the other for what they have done that delivers pain to us. And we're very quick to do the same in relation to ourselves, to hate ourselves, to resent ourselves, to blame ourselves, to have expectations of the other and the expectations of ourselves. And those expectations are that the other should be perfect and that I should be perfect. Now that attitude of seeing myself as the doer and feeling shame towards myself for not feeling happy, feeling shame towards myself for not having acted perfectly in my life, feeling blame towards the other, and feeling pride for those actions that happen through me that have delivered positive outcomes. That attitude of personal doership is essentially misguided. It is seeing ourselves in a light that is inaccurate. It is mistaking a biological instrument, a very complex biological instrument created by life with its shortcomings and its good points, that is forced to function according to its design and the circumstance it finds itself in. It mistakes those dynamics and instead says, whatever happens is my doing. Whatever happens is the other's doing. You could have acted differently. Instead of seeing that we are complex instruments forced to act exactly the way we act. So our attitude could be, oh, they acted that way, I acted the way I acted, and instead of saying I should have acted differently, we just need to reverse engineer why we acted the way we acted. Instead we say, oh, I should have functioned differently. My view that I suggest is a more accurate attitude towards what happens is to see what happened and then reverse engineer your understanding as to why that happened. And in simple terms, the explanation as to why anything happens through any of us is because of our genes and up-to-date conditioning coupled with the circumstance that we find ourselves in. Genes and up-to-date conditioning refer to, or what it really means is, it's a way of describing the human being as they are in this moment, in any moment. In any moment, the human being is a result of its genes and up-to-date conditioning. The genes refer to the coming together of the sperm and the egg, a blueprint being put in place, and then over time, that genetic blueprint grows and turns into flesh and bones and brains and hearts and lungs and legs and arms. And that organism that grows is conditioned, is programmed by the circumstance that it's growing in, by the environment it's growing in. And the environment can be described as being new conditioning delivered to the organism moment after moment after moment. And the cumulative effect of the new conditioning is what we can call our up-to-date conditioning. So the human being at any point is a result of its genes and up-to-date conditioning. So the words coming out of my mouth are forced to be the way they are because of my genes and up-to-date conditioning, which really means because of the way Roger is, because of the way Roger is designed. And Roger doesn't exist independent of the circumstance. Roger is one component of the circumstance. Other components interact with this biological and psychological organism, and responses happen. Reactions happen. So, like two chemicals coming together, they have their chemical composition that they didn't choose. Life put that in place. The two chemicals come together and there is a reaction. It might be an inert reaction. It might be an explosive reaction. And the chemicals don't sit down and debate how they're going to react. They react according to their chemical composition and how that composition responds, reacts to whatever they come in contact with. And the human being is a very complex version of that. We find ourselves in an environment and we see something, we hear something, we smell something, we taste something, we touch something. And from whatever we see, smell, taste, touch, hear, a response happens. A thought may arise that says, oh, that's a big tree. That's a strange bird. That was a silly move. That thought is a result of whatever was seen, and that is the input into the machine that processes that and creates a thought. And that thought then may inspire an action. And all of it is as impersonal as the stage before. And our attitude takes all of that as my doing. Oh, I saw the bird. I commented on the bird. I picked up my camera and took a picture of the bird. Now, all of those things happened. The bird was seen. The thought did arise. The camera was picked up and the photo was taken. What is important is attitudinally to understand why or what the mechanism is for all of that happening. And as I described, the body-mind organism, the human being, didn't choose to be here. A sequence of events happened that led to the human being being conceived, and then a series of impersonal movements, which we can call the development, the growth of that organism, happened, influenced by factors outside of the control of that organism, new conditioning coming in moment after moment after moment, and a result of that genetic blueprint that the organism didn't put in place. All of that unfolded. So impersonal. And here we are, taking whatever comes out of this body-mind organism, taking whatever comes out of the other body-mind organism as a personal action that should be different. And it simply comes down to that attitude which creates suffering or peace of mind. The attitude of personal doership creates a resistance to what is. The attitude of non-doership, which really means the absence of the attitude of personal doership, means an automatic acceptance because life is seen to be an unfolding according to life's will. Life is seen to be unfolding according to God's will. Life is seen to be unfolding, an unfolding that couldn't be happening any other way. It's the thinking mind that gets involved in how life unfolds and extends the events that happened in the moment horizontally in time, carrying something that has happened into the future, which really means it's now in the present, but the event is in the past. And the thinking of the thinking mind about what has happened, about why the other shouldn't have acted this way, why I shouldn't or should have said what I said or didn't say. Feeling resentment to the other, feeling shame. That horizontal thinking is holding on to the past, and it disturbs the stillness that would be there if that thinking was not there. Now, that's a description of what might happen. It's a description of what does happen. The thinking mind, which carries the past into the present and disturbs the peace of the present moment. So that is a description of what suffering is. Expectation about the future that disturbs the present moment. So that is a description of what might happen or what does happen. And the end of suffering is a description of what might happen. But remember, being attached to the end of suffering is a form of suffering, because it may not be your destiny for there to be for there to be peace of mind in this moment. And so if it's not someone's destiny for there to be peace of mind, which means their destiny for there to be some sort of uncomfortableness, then the insistence on peace of mind as something that could be or should be here just means more resistance, more involvement with what is. And that's why I was talking about life being an evolution, a work in progress, and that when there is suffering, if we understand that suffering is because the human entity includes in it, as part of it, this psychological doer, this psychological entity attached to outcomes that sees oneself as the doer and the others as the doer, that's a result of life creating those structures that enable the psychological me to be there. And that is what I referred to as a glitch that in the future may not exist. In the future, we might find that as a result of the world in which humans are born, the conditioning that they receive, that the me identity has less chance of surviving because the adults in that world may have moved past the psychological me. And then new babies, new humans that come into a different environment where they are nurtured differently, where they are educated differently, where values are different to those that are different to those that are instilled by parents today. Not because parents are doing a bad job, but because parents are designed to deeply believe that happiness is to be found in outcomes. And so that's what gets passed on. And in the future, that may not be the world that humans are born into. And so suffering may be a thing of the past at some point. And when we look back, if that happens, we look back at humanity and we see, wow, an evolution of humanity has happened where suffering has been eliminated, where the psychological me is not as significant a part of humanity as it used to be. And then we could say that evolution has improved certain functions. that the designers have ironed out some of the glitches. But for now, the glitches exist. And so when suffering arises, maybe our attitude can be, oh, this is one of the forms of the current human condition. And it's impersonal. It's not because anyone is doing it wrong. It's because as biological robots, we are designed to think along the lines that I am not a biological robot. You are not a biological robot. You are the doer, I am the doer. And I am functioning according to my own free will, not affected, not influenced by factors outside of my control. Because if the biological instrument, if the biological robot says, I can see that how I function delivered pain, not denying that how I functioned delivered a negative outcome, a painful outcome. However, I can't deny that I functioned to the best of my ability. I thought that what I was doing was going to deliver the best outcome. And it turns out that the assessment based on the best of my capabilities was incorrect. The outcome was negative. The biological robot with a certain attitude will say, so I don't deny that the outcome wasn't good, but I can't hate myself for having functioned in a way that delivered that unfortunate outcome, because my design forced me to act that way. Now, this isn't an excuse. This isn't an excuse that somehow will prevent us from having to suffer consequences. So it's not something that we can go around telling society, hey, too bad, so sad, I'm not the doer. That's not the point. The point is for us to have that internal attitude. That means we still will have to suffer the consequences. Society will, reward us for those things that deliver pleasure to society, and they will punish us for those things that deliver pain to society. That's just an impersonal consequence. It's part of the unfolding of life. However, attitudinally, we can have the attitude that sees that the pleasure or pain that was delivered was inevitable according to my design. So it's not an excuse. It's actually seeing things as they really are. And seeing things as they are doesn't prevent the human being from acting to the best of their ability. It doesn't prevent us from learning from our mistakes. The mistakes become part of the new conditioning that then becomes part of our up-to-date conditioning that may or may not change how we function in a similar situation down the track. So if people have an issue with the descriptions of non-doership, often it's because they are interpreting what the concept is saying and interpreting it to mean something that the concept doesn't really mean. Because the attitude of non-doership doesn't mean not trying to improve a situation if it can be improved. We will always function according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning. And on a biological level, the body is always going to want to move towards pleasure and away from pain. And so if there is something that can be done circumstantially to improve a situation, then by all means do it, which is really a description that says the body will function to try and improve the situation. But the outcome is not in our control. Sometimes we get what we want, sometimes we don't get what we want. And Ramesh used to say sometimes we get much more than what we want. It doesn't prevent us from recognizing situations that have delivered pain or pleasure to the other. So the understanding of non-doership is not something that will get in the way of us acknowledging, yes, the function that happened through me did deliver a painful outcome. And it doesn't prevent us from apologizing. It's not my intention to hurt you, and I see that the actions that happened through me, you could even say my actions, as long as one understands, not me as a doer, but me as a biological instrument functioning. I understand my actions hurt you. It wasn't my intention to hurt you, so I apologize for that. And we might find ourselves doing something to try and add pleasure into that person's life, to rectify something that may have gone wrong previously. So to the extent that we can see that suffering happens, even though we might understand that we're not the doer, we see that the way that our genes and up-to-date conditioning are in a particular moment may include the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership and attachment to outcome, and in a circumstance, the blame, the involvement might happen. And if it happens, then the understanding, oh, the human condition is a work in progress, means that there might be more capacity to be uninvolved, to understand that our destiny includes suffering and that we're not in control of how much suffering there will be. That is part of the predetermined story of life. So I'll open up for some questions and we'll go from there. Hello, Martin.
Hi, Roger. Hi, Roger.
Hi there.
I just want to thank you, Roger, for what you do. It's entirely changed my attitude to life and how I just let life live me now. But there's one question I want to ask you. I just wonder if Ramesh ever had a view on why people think they want to kill themselves or actually do. For me, it just seems that people get to a position where they just find life intolerable, that they just shouldn't be here or have no reason to be here. I mean, be on this earth. I just wondered what your and Ramesh's view was on that.
I'm not entirely sure I know Ramesh's view. I know my view. I'm pretty sure Ramesh would say the same thing or did say the same thing. And that is that it's understandable that if someone has a certain experience of life, and more particular, an experience of themselves that is very uncomfortable, that the uncomfortableness with oneself, it's a sort of inescapable thing. It's like wherever you go, it's there. right?
Yes.
The uncomfortableness, you can't escape it, the uncomfortableness with oneself. And depending on the intensity of that uncomfortableness with oneself, will determine how intolerable it is, how unacceptable it is. And we can understand, I guess, that with physical pain, that when physical pain gets to a certain level, someone could rationally say, it doesn't make sense for me to keep experiencing this. It would be such a relief if I wasn't, if life came to an end, and let's hope that that's it, that after death, that's it. Or maybe let's hope there's something much better, but let's assume that that's it. Then the thinking is, it makes sense if the intensity of the experience is, past a certain threshold. And so my assessment is that if someone does commit suicide, or does whatever the word or the terminology that appeals to you in explaining someone taking their life, my reverse engineering is that their experience of life led them to that. It made sense to them to seek something different, or rather seek the absence of this.
Yes. Yeah, I really get that. That makes absolute sense. It's yeah, I think that's one of the. I get what you're saying, Roger. That's sort of very, very clear. But yeah, I'm just sort of not struggling with things at the moment, or perhaps I am. I don't know. But it's just that I went for breakfast somewhere, well, lunch somewhere today, and it was really quite peaceful there, and the food was fantastic. And it's like all these things. In the background, there was a conversation between three women, and all they were doing was really complaining about their husbands. It was very amusing that one woman said that her husband had been working on the roof and come in and was very dirty and very hot, and instead of having a shower as he normally does, he decided to have a bath in the bath that she had just cleaned. And she said, "Oh, we will make it dirty." And he said, well, that's what baths are for, isn't it? And she said, "Well, yes, but I've only just cleaned it." He said, "Well, you've got nothing else to do, have you?" And she was the resentment that she was complaining to the other women about his behaviour. You just think this is. It's just insanity. And another woman she was complaining to said, "Yes, that's why I'm on my fourth husband." Anyway, yeah, I'm sort of struggling at the moment, sort of existing in just witnessing just sheer insanity all around me, because I live on my own at the moment, and yeah, it's really quite. Thanks, Roger. Your earlier explanation was very succinct and appreciated. Thanks.
You're welcome. Hi, Elena.
Hello, Roger.
Hello, hello.
I have two questions, Roger. Do you
Go
hear
ahead.
me well?
Yes, I do.
What can you say? What can you say about energetical manipulation, which is happening lately around the world?
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Well, I can give you an example. if you live with somebody and she's trying to manipulate you, and you do things, and after you realize it wasn't your faults, it's like, I don't know if I was quite clear.
Well, you know, there's a lot. There's so many factors that go into the way that we function, and sometimes we're convinced that we function a certain way because of these factors. And you know, I've seen certain people saying that they're being energetically targeted by other parties and people, and I don't know if this is possible. I don't know if this is what happens. It could be just a way that someone has come up with to justify certain feelings or to explain certain feelings. So I'm not saying that these people are wrong, but I don't have much to say on the topic because it's not something I'm familiar with.
And do you still hear me?
Yes, I can.
How we can let's say we have a habit, and how we're trying for many years to let go, but it's still there. It's something we can do.
Well, the teaching says we're not the doer, right? So if you have a habit, it's not because you are doing it. It's because life has designed you to have that habit. And so the attitude of insisting that the habit changes is the attitude of personal doership. It's the attitude of personal doership that says, how can I change the habit? Now, it is valid to say, is there any conditioning that can be delivered from life through you that might change the habit? Understanding that we're not in control of whether it changes or not, so, you know, I surrender to the fact it might not change. But so surrendering to the fact it might not change, is there any new conditioning that could be delivered by life that could be reasonably expected to have some impact on the habit? Now, if that's how we ask, then it's demonstrating a good understanding of how things change. It's demonstrating a good understanding that we're not in control of the outcome, and that if the outcome stays the same, attitudinally, we understand that we've done what we can, which includes asking for new conditioning that may have an impact on the habit. And yet, having done what we can, the habit still hasn't changed. So if that's our attitude in the question, that's great, because it means that we're not getting caught up anywhere. But if the attitude is, I have a habit, I don't like it, I want it to change, I've been trying to change it for many years, it hasn't changed, how can I change it? Then there's a different attitude in that questioning, right? And so my answer essentially is not about what is the habit, let me tell you how to change it, or give you some information, some new conditioning that might change it. But more importantly, it's talking about this dynamic at the base of the question, because that's where the peace of mind gets found. The peace of mind, or the happiness, isn't found in the habit changing, because the habit changing is really just part of the flow of life. It's more pleasure and less pain. And our happiness isn't to be found in pleasure or pain. So first and foremost, it's about us adjusting our attitude and surrendering, in a sense. It's like, oh, this habit might be my destiny for the rest of my life. I see. In that case, I have to surrender to the habit being there.
It's very difficult to surrender. You can say it's surrendering, but you cannot surrender, really.
No, we get surrendered. You can't do surrendering. The doer wants pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. So the doer can't surrender to life as it is. The doer can only insist on pleasure. So when we get surrendered, it's when life hits us with a realization, I can't do this. I've been trying my whole life. If I was the doer, if I was in control, I would have done it by now. And so surrender happens when, in a flash, it's like, maybe I don't have the capacity as a human being to control life. And that's when we get surrendered.
I suppose this is the case also in repeating, for example, the victim program over and over again.
Sorry, I must have missed the first part of the question. Is there peace, did you say?
No. I said it's the case also in, you notice you repeating in your life the same program, for example, the victim program, over and over again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the victim program is doership and attachment to outcome. So it's like we obviously have saying this outcome is bad, this person is delivering pain to me. So we have the outcome that we are the victim of, and the other person is the doer that is doing the perpetrating. So our attitude of being a victim is seeing my happiness in pleasure, 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 and the other is delivering me pain, and seeing the other as the doer, the one that is delivering the pain is the doer, and they shouldn't be doing it. And so that's the primary suffering. Now, if we get involved in the fact that that's how we function, and say, I shouldn't function like that, and insist that we don't function like that, and yet we keep functioning like that, and then we keep insisting that we don't function like that, then there's another layer of suffering on top of the victim. Then we become a victim to ourselves. So I'm a victim to the other, and I'm a victim of myself. So if we see this habit of being a victim to the other, and we can't get out of it, then maybe we just surrender and say, life has designed me to have this victim program in place. And it's like, what to do? At least on that level, on the outer level, there is the attitude of non-doership. There is the recognition, oh, I am habitually seeing myself as a victim, and that is because of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. In particular, the up-to-date conditioning that I would call the thinking mind, the psychological reaction. And if that's your genes, if your genes and up-to-date conditioning include that psychological identity, there's no other option but for that to play out, for that to be how we feel about the other.
So, as I understood, the way is surrendering, even if this is not possible, but still surrendering.
Well, I'm not suggesting that someone has to do surrendering. I'm describing that if surrendering happens, then there's less suffering. But surrendering isn't something that the doer does, but rather it's life delivers new conditioning that creates an insight. Just like that, it's like, oh, I simply cannot be the doer. Even my victim is a happening. So in that moment, there is surrendering. If we go and say, okay, I have to surrender, then that attitude, I have to surrender, is the opposite of surrender. It is trying to do surrender, which isn't surrender. So surrender happens out of the blue. You know, when we really just have a thought, I simply cannot be the doer. But on what basis do we see that we cannot be the doer? And in this teaching, it says everything is a happening according to God's will. So the thought that comes up and says, you know, I am a victim, that thought is a happening. It just arises out of nowhere. And if we want a causal explanation, it arises out of our genes and up-to-date conditioning. No one created it. It was created by the genes and up-to-date conditioning, by the biological robot. And that's the description. It can't be any clearer than that, right? Your thinking is not in your control. Your thinking happens. Your feelings of suffering happen. No one is making them happen. They just happen. That's the concept. Now, that's not, it's easy for me to describe it. Whether it sinks in for someone or not is not in my control and not in the other's control. If it sinks in, then as it sinks in, the insight might happen and says, all of this worry about my victim or all of this worry about the way I am, I simply cannot be the doer. Everything is a happening. So let me just leave it be. And, you know, it sounds like I'm saying this is what you have to think, but I'm saying this is what needs to happen.
It's clear, less the energetical manipulation, but maybe
If
it's
that's
it's an
happening,
excuse.
if that's happening, it's a happening. There's no one doing it. So there is another body-mind organism, and they are designed by life to energetically manipulate you. So it's your destiny, and your destiny is being delivered through a particular body-mind organism designed by life in order to do that. So that can be another way of accepting. It's like, oh, it's my destiny to be energetically manipulated, and it's the destiny of the other to be the instrument through which that gets delivered.
Not so easy to accept this, right?
Sorry, say that again?
It's not so easy to accept something like this.
It's impossible if it's not your destiny. So the doer won't find much satisfaction in what I'm saying, because I'm saying it's not in your control.
Okay, thank you very much, Roger.
You're welcome. Thank you for dropping in. Hi, Sharon.
Hi, Roger. You know, what's happening for me now is the awareness is becoming stronger. The presence is becoming so strong that it's not like I have to access awareness. It just is. And I'm realizing that this awareness is what's living, is what we are. We think we're these bodies. You know, I could be wrong, I've done so much, you know, work with different, you know, Sailor Bob, Ramash, you, a lot of non-dual Course in Miracles. And, you know, when you talked about the suicide, I had a very serious depression where I wanted to commit suicide. But in my mind, I remember, and this, you know, it's not really, I don't even know who I'm talking about sometimes, but I just remember thinking I would hurt everyone if I did that. What comes to me is that the people that commit suicide, it's God's, it's the divine, it's like what Ramash would call divine hypnosis. But yet the divine is actually doing it all, even the ego. Is that so?
Yes, agreed. According to the concept here, nothing in life is outside of life, and life is a closed unit, and so nothing is independent of life. Everything is interconnected. Ultimately, all of life is what we could call the divine unfolding, or life unfolding, consciousness unfolding, whatever word you use, source unfolding, energy unfolding. And so, you know, the bird flying across the sky is life unfolding, is source unfolding. And the good actions and the bad actions is life unfolding, source unfolding. And yes, as you say, even the doership is life unfolding, source unfolding, energy unfolding.
Yeah, so it's like but the thing that I remember reading in in one of Sailor Bob's books is that like I'm an artist, but I've never been, that's just coming through me from the divine, right? Or from my genes and up-to-date conditioning. We really are all the divine. We're all the infinite, am I right?
Yes, including the child tantruming is an expression of life. I mean, I don't use the word divine because, frankly, for me, I've gone in terms of an evolution of thinking to a point where the word divine might have made sense and appealed to me in the past. Now, I'd rather say life. But I can appreciate that someone else might resonate with the word divine, but it doesn't resonate with me now. But I can understand why it resonates with you, for example.
Well, I actually use life too. I think it's saying all the same thing. These are just words. You know, I don't really have an attachment to words. But, you know, for me, I mean, I always thought the me was seeing, and I know, you know, through my practice that, you know, the awareness is seeing out of all of our eyes, you know, like in other words, and then I do this checking where this, you know, you go inside and there's no reference point. So when someone like my friend, one of my best friends' son died the other day, I mean, a couple of weeks ago from alcohol poisoning. And like my son was addicted to drugs for years and now he's doing well. He's still on medication, but you know, she keeps asking me why, and she's been doing the same work as me. And there is no answer, is there? I mean, it just is happening. It's not like the divine doesn't say, well, I think that one, or life doesn't say, I'm going to have this one die. It just is we don't know anything. It's all at random, I think.
Well, random from the point of the observer here, this observer. From another side, we might say, well, it's not at all random because it's actually, you know, one thing leading to another, leading to another, leading to another, but we can't understand what influences are at play at each moment on every aspect of life. So yes, I agree with what you're saying, is that it just is because it is. You know, in more simplistic terms, you could say, well, he was born, he developed a certain way, he found himself in a certain set of circumstances, and one thing led to another, and it ended up with him dying. So yes, it just is, and that can be very hard for someone to accept. So I'm not saying, well, it's easy to accept. In fact, the very opposite. It's impossible to accept if non-acceptance is what we're designed to do. But my explanation is similar to what you've said. It really just is.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy for me. I'm actually often on grieving. I mean, because I'm very close to her. And that's another thing I've realized in awakening, that everything is inclusive. So when you're crying or when you have fear, it's not a big deal. Like I used to think, because I started with the Course in Miracles and the 12 steps. So I used to think, well, love was separate from the other emotions. But I think because we're these beings of, and I still do recognize we're bodies. I heard you speak of that. We don't ignore that we have this physical manifestation. On the way we say we're not a body, but we then get back to the fact that yes, indeed, we have this body. But the thing that I do see is, and I wouldn't even put, I have no idea what would happen if one of my children would pass. The one that had that disease was the thing that got me to this process, and he's still doing well. But what I hear my friend keep saying is, she keeps the mind keeps beating her up. It's all guilt about she wasn't a good enough mother. And tell me I'm right about this. Maybe I'm wrong, so I'll be open to it. But the mother doesn't really raise the child, right? It's life.
It's life through the mother, but the mother doesn't have a choice on how she shows up and what she delivers or what she doesn't deliver. So it's attitudinally, it's right to say it's life. More accurately, it's life through the functioning of the mother and a whole lot of other influences. So it's definitely not only the mother. And the mother could be perfect and still the child could end up in this outcome because of other factors that were very distant from the mother's input. And so the right attitude is to say, well, it was really all a happening and none of it is personal. So I'm on your side again, that the attitude of guilt is making it about, what I should have done, that I could have done it differently. And, I just don't think that seeing life that way is seeing it clearly.
Right. And you've been there's so many different, the way the instruments are teaching and awakening, you're very compassionate and you never tell anyone what they need to do, which I find to be the clearest teaching, because when somebody keeps saying, well, you need to meditate, how can they know that when this is all happening? Like, everybody's in the perfect place. And I don't know, I find you to be extraordinarily clear and just someone that, the divine's living through, I guess, or life's living through, that's just helping all of us wake up. That's just all I think that's, other than probably your own peace of mind, you're just such a beautiful being. And I just think we're all very blessed to have you. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. I'm amazed sometimes at the fact that patience happens, because sometimes I'm not patient. But yes, I'm glad it expresses this way. It means less hassles for me. Hi, Alex.
Hi. So I have a question. Yeah, firstly, I'd like to say just thank you for your perspective. I find a lot of non-duality. There's a lot of talk about rejecting the physicality of the world or the world being a dream. And I can sort of appreciate that perspective too, but you have a very good perspective of not using the word divine and just a very kind of, very practical kind of approach of just about what we can actually see. So I appreciate that.
Thank you.
But as a teacher, I'm sure you know that it's very difficult to phrase things in a way that they won't be misunderstood. And in a way, as a student of non-duality, sometimes it's very like difficult to actually phrase the question in a way that actually points to like what really my problem, as I see it, kind of is. And I know that you talk a lot about free will, and to me, like two big things in non-duality, two big topics are that you are not the doer, and the other big topic is that you are not the experiencer. And to me, I kind of intellectually and also to some extent, like upon inspection, it makes sense to me. Like it really makes sense that I'm not the doer. Even though I overlook this fact, like in daily life, a lot of the time, like every time I sort of think about it and check, it's really clear that, yeah, I'm not the doer. Things appear in consciousness, and yeah. On the other side, it's really a lot less clear, in the sense that, like, am I a subject? Is the subject a feeling, or is it like beyond the feeling? Does it exist, or is it just nothing? You know, it's not an object you can sort of concentrate on very easily. Like if you concentrate on the breath, you can kind of like tell how you're going. Like, am I doing well? Oh yeah, I'm concentrating, or I'm distracted. If you kind of concentrate on the subject, it's a lot less like there's no like objective clear experience to focus on, and it's a bit like I just feel like I'm always distracted. Am I doing this right? Like, am I not doing this right? You know, like when you try to do like go to the I am or something, and you're like, you know, oh, you know, what does it mean? So you go like to the thing behind your eyes, and that kind of feels like something, and then you try after a week, you try like going to the feeling in your chest, and you're like, oh yeah, that's also kind of I am, but it feels completely different. So like, what does like Nisargadatta or someone say, like go to the I am? Like, it seems like there's 1,000 different ways to do it, you know, like, and they all feel slightly different, you know. But the issue is not really about techniques. The issue is like, when something is happening, like when something really intense is happening, like pain or pleasure. Let's focus on pain, like pain or an unpleasant emotion. Like I really appreciate the way you sober-mindedly explain like all the processes that go on, and how one thing leads to another, and you know, bodies move around, and you know, like genes, up-to-date conditioning, and all that. But like when you're living life and something, and I'll give you like an extreme example, like a really unrealistic one, just to kind of like illustrate my point, and I hope that you'll understand kind of like what I'm getting at. You know, if I'm in a room and there are two doors, there are two choices, and in choice number one, I'll go and I'll eat an ice cream, and in door number two, I'm gonna have my arm sawed off, right? And it's all well and good to say, oh well, you know, these are things that could happen. The body will decide what to do, and then it'll walk through one of the doors. In one, like a dairy product will get consumed. In the other, some proteins will get, you know, rearranged. But like when it really is going to happen to you, it's kind of like, it really seems like if I had my arm sawn off, that's really, really bad, like with a capital B. And it's really personal, it's happening to me. It doesn't seem like some abstract preference, like, oh, I'm stressed that my career is not like going well, and or something like that. It feels like, you know, like this is like unacceptably bad, and like I wish I wasn't alive, sort of thing, for this. And it seems really kind of personal. And like, I know this is an extreme example, but like there are like, you know, less extreme examples are nevertheless like personal in real life. They seem personal, like when something, even if it's just a feeling, like you're feeling stressed because like you're in some work meeting, you have to report that the project failed or something. Like, it's not really a big deal, but like you might have some unpleasant emotion, right? And it seems like really like, I'm not the experiencer. Like it just doesn't seem like, it just doesn't seem to be like understandable. So yeah, just any comments on that?
Yes, okay. So there's a couple of things. One, if you imagine events, like you imagine your arm being sawn off, right? There's an inherent problem in that, because our imagination is one thing and the actual event happening is another thing. And our imagination of it is always going to be in the realm of thought and expectation and assumptions. So we're not going to feel like, oh, that's okay. It's not possible for us to think about that and imagine it to be okay. And it's also, if it's happening, it's not that it's going to be okay while it's happening. It's not that, oh, that's not happening to me, I'm not the body. And that's not what I'm getting at, right? I'll explain why teachings say that, because they're trying to bring about a change. So what it's talking about in the framework here is that things like that, even that extreme, happen. You know, you could be in a motorcycle accident and lose legs and arms and what have you. And afterwards, like if you're in hospital or recovering in a wheelchair, there is the potential where your attitude can be, yes, these things happen in life and this thing happened to me. And with that attitude, with that having happened, it is possible after it's happened, because that's what we're really talking about in terms of peace of mind, is whether we find ourselves with an attitude that says, you know, why did this happen to me? This shouldn't have happened. This is not what my life is meant to be. And so then if that is persistent horizontally in time, which is completely understandable if that's the case, right? Actually, the norm is for that to be the case. And the unusual but possible is where someone has an attitude that says, I'm connected to myself, and even without the use of my arm, I am. Even without the use of my arm and my leg, I'm experiencing life. I'm experiencing life with limitations compared to the past, but the past is what was then, and now this is what is now. So that attitude can very much be there. It's very much a potentiality if our system and our connection to self and our appreciation of the essence, the consciousness, which is unaffected by, you know, whether you have an arm or you don't have an arm, that consciousness is there. And so if attention can land on that and keep coming back to a place of groundedness, and the thinking mind doesn't kick in, then by default we will be at peace, because it's only the thinking mind that creates the uncomfortableness. So if that thinking mind doesn't happen, there is peace. And that's what liberation is, according to this teaching. It's a state where we don't go into certain types of thinking and feeling that would be very, or are very common and ordinary ways of relating to life, especially when life turns out, you know, to be unfortunate in circumstance. What I'm very clear on is that I have no interest, even if this attitude can be there, I have no interest in testing it out unless it's my destiny. I'm not going to ask someone, oh, you know, as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't bother me whether I have an arm or not, because my attitude will be this way. I appreciate that having the arm means something additional in a way in terms of circumstance. So I don't wish to have to put that attitude to test, although life is always going to take things away from us. So I don't want someone to think that I'm saying it doesn't make a difference. What I'm saying is it doesn't make a difference to our happiness if we have the right attitude. So I hope that part is clear. Does that make sense so far?
no, yeah, so no, that makes sense. Like I have no problem with like, you know, acting to avoid pain or whatever for a realized being or whatever you want to call it. My problem is more like, what is the difference between achieving a personal kind of inner peace through a kind of attitudinal, you know, behavior change versus like the non-dual insight, like I'm not the experiencer. Like, what is the difference?
I don't think there is. I think the methodology is different in a sense. So what in non-duality, so typically the word experience is used in a very specific context to refer to a very specific type of perception. So the word experience usually means knowing life from the perspective of the body, where life is experienced as subject-object relationship. So I, the body, am the subject, and the table and the chair and the other people are objects. And so that is sort of, or that is referred to as the unliberated view, is a view where you are the experiencer and life is experience. And it has this, it's very important to understand that experiencer means knowing yourself as a separate physical subject, meaning knowing yourself as the body and assuming that the body is the subject, and that objects outside of yourself are objects perceived or objects experienced. And so then it's called experiencing in life. And experiencing happens always from the perspective of a body. And because we've developed a certain way from a young age, where objects are seen to be outside of ourself, and ourself is known to be a physical entity, we've identified with being the body, and therefore the objects are outside of us. And so there's this sense of separation, me and the objects. And so that's what's referred to as subject-object relationship. And when we point to subject, we're really pointing to an object that is believed or assumed to be the subject. And so by subject, we mean that which is perceiving, that which is real, that which is aware. And as part of this growing up development of subject-object relationship, the identification with the body means identification with pleasure and pain. That means identification with I am added to by the addition of pleasure and I am taken away from by the addition of pain. And so when we know ourselves as the subject-object, aware of external objects, we assume that losing an arm, which is circumstantial and pain, is losing part of who I am. And so if that becomes our frame of reference, that I am the body, I am a physical entity, then everything gets measured relative to that identity, that idea of ourself. And because the body is on the realm of circumstance, on the realm of pleasure and pain, we then identify with pleasure and pain. Means we're attached to pleasure and we push pain away, believing that that is the best we can aim for in life, believing that pain is an attack on who I am and pleasure is an addition to who I am. And that relationship to the flow of life, that relationship to circumstance is part of the false identity and part of the uncomfortableness. And so non-dual teachings, having identified that that is part of the ingrained problem, part of what leads to suffering, part of the false identity, the false self, the self with the small s, because that's the what's been recognized by the teachings and the teachers, a delivery method, description that tries to undo that identification, tries to undo that way that the life experience is produced by the brain, let's say, or by whatever is producing the life experience, trying to bring about a shift. And that shift that can happen is a shift where an appreciation of an essence or something formless presents itself. And so that's referred to as self-realization, right? The realization of the self, and the self that is not the body, the self that is not the thinking, the self that is not emotions. So it is the self that is covered up by the identification with the body, identification with thinking, identification with emotions. So that's the self with the small s. And so self-realization is the recognition or the realization of the part of the human or the aspect of the human or the aspect of life that was covered up. And part of the methodology of that spiritual teachings, Advaita teachings use to bring about that shift is to keep reinforcing you are not the body. You are not an object. You are not your thoughts, or you are not thoughts, you are not emotions. So the process of neti is not this, not that. So essentially it's pointing to everything that can be perceived, or everything that can be perceived as a physical or a non-physical object. So thoughts, can you be aware of a thought? Yes, if you can be aware of a thought, you are not the thought. If you can be aware of the body, can you be aware of the body? Yes, so you are not the body. Can you be aware of the tree? Yes, you can, so you are not the tree. So neti is not this and not that. Anything that you can be aware of, that is not what you are. And there are some sort of fairly cheap concepts thrown in to make the point. When I say cheap concepts, is that when we really get down to it, they're not the truth. And a lot of people just throw them out as though there's some absolute, proof. Like, the eye can't see itself. So awareness can't see itself. So if you can see the body, awareness can't be the body. Because just like the eye can't see itself, the eye can only see things outside that are not it. It's saying awareness can only see things that are not it. So if you see a thought, it's not it. And obviously we're not talking about visual seeing. Awareness. If you can be aware of a thought, you are not it. If you can be aware of the body, you are not that. And what you're left with in the end might be this question, so what am I? And hopefully the question doesn't end up being just a mental question, but leads to a recognition of that which is aware. And along with those concepts that I've just put forward, there are a lot of other concepts that tie in with this, like time and space don't exist, causality doesn't exist, the past doesn't exist, the eyes aren't doing the seeing, the ears aren't doing the hearing, the brain isn't doing the thinking. So there's a whole lot of collapsing of life as we've grown up to know it. And what those inputs do, especially when a body receives them as truth, it starts to refocus on the present moment in ways described by the teachings. It's like a thought just arises out of nowhere. Now, we might hear that out of nowhere meaning, and we might think it's just a figure of speech, like a thought just arises out of nowhere. What it's really pointing at is, if you are really present, you will see that there is no thought, and then a thought happens. And it says, okay, when there was no thought, and then the thought is there, so it came out of Nowhere. Not just as a figure of speech, but for it to be seen in action. Just like speaking happens. There was no speaking, and then speaking came out of nowhere, as opposed to speaking came out of someone's mouth. What it's trying to point to is speaking arises in the field of consciousness. Thoughts arise in the field of consciousness. It's already told us that cause and effect is not how things happen. So it's saying thoughts don't come from your brain, they come out of nothing and then subside back into nothing. So this is a completely different way of reframing life to and reducing it down to the present moment only. It's essentially saying there is no outside, there is no here and there is nowhere to go, there is just what is here now. And a relentless description of life that way, especially when it is described as truth, as reality, knowing life differently, knowing it according to cause and effect, and believing in the past and the future is all illusion. The more that life is described as truth or illusion, right or wrong, ignorance versus understanding, the more the seeker gravitates towards what is described as truth. And what is described as truth often is a framework that doesn't sustain psychological thinking. Because psychological thinking is based on the belief in the past, a belief in a future, belief in causality, belief in a separate independent other that does things according to their volition. And this reframing of life is that life is just happening in this moment like a dream, arising in consciousness, that the tree could in any moment just vanish, and that an apple could come floating past, because life is being created as a spontaneous creation, and the source could create anything. It doesn't have to create things in orderly fashion according to laws of gravity and cause and time and all of that. It can create whatever it wants, however it wants, because it's a dream, it's all an illusion. And so these descriptions are there to refocus the seeker, to keep bringing the seeker back through essentially a methodology of meditation, of presence, to a point where their thinking and their relationship to life changes so radically that everything is just seen as a spontaneous happening. And especially the body is seen as just an object. And a shift happens where the whole experience is known to arise within the consciousness that is aware of it, not separate from that consciousness. And that consciousness witnesses everything, including the body, as an object that arises within that subjectivity. And that shift essentially is a shift that marks the beginning of a witnessing that allows a sense of being that is not identified with what is happening. Now, that to me is not liberation. That is an awakening that has broken the spell of identification with outcomes, has broken the spell of identification with the body as what I am. And from there, an integration needs to happen such that that connection to awareness, the connection to consciousness or beingness, whatever you want to call it, can get reintegrated such that the experience is no longer that the body is arising in consciousness, but rather that the consciousness is now functioning through the body and aware of life. And so it sort of takes us 360 360 degrees back to experiencing life from the perspective of the body. However, it's not a 360 that takes us back to exactly the same place. It's a 360 that takes us back to being a human, but now no longer with identification with outcomes, because this end of experience has happened. What end of experience really means, where knowing the present moment experience as a world of objects perceived by a subject object, that fell away, and the whole of the moment was seen from the perspective of formless awareness that was aware of the body as an object. And that is described as the end of experience, the end of subject-object relationship. And if it's the end of experience, it's the end of the experiencer. The experiencer, it was the body that felt like it was the subject. And sometimes it's referred to as the end of the experiencer, and there is just experiencing, as in no more dancer and the dance, but rather the merging of the dancer and the dance, and there is just dancing happening. There is just experiencing happening. However, in the methodology where experience is used very exclusively to mean subject-object relationship, there'll tend to be an aversion from using the word experience at all. So it won't be experiencing, it'd be just some other terminology like awaring. Awaring is happening. So that specifically they won't use, or that teaching won't use the word experiencing, because actually liberation or awakening is said to be the end of the experiencer, and the experiencer dissolves, and then there is just awaring of life. So that's what the end of the experiencer means, is where life is perceived from what seems to be formless awareness that is not connected to the body. Obviously, that is not that accurate, because if I did get a pair of garden scissors, and it's a bit graphic, inflicted some physical pain on the one that supposedly is, not the experiencer, there is very clearly a link between the body and what is awared. So as that starts to become more evident for the one that has had this shift, then some of the terms, some of the explanations of things get tempered so that they become more accurate with what is from different perspectives. And so then we stop saying, I'm not the body, because it becomes appreciated that, well, the body is the instrument through which life is experienced. And from one perspective, we very much have to acknowledge, I am the body, I am the person. Because if we don't, this other awakened view starts to show to be quite one-sided, to not be very integrated, to not hold the paradox of life. So that's not a criticism of that. It's just a description of a process that has to go through stages. And so the awakening process that I've been talking about is a very valid part of that process. So hopefully the distinction of the word experience as subject-object relationship and describing that shift can happen, that enables witnessing and brings about a break in the identity and how we know ourselves, such that outcomes become less important, answers your question a little bit. And mind you, we don't have to go through that process. There are other methodologies and other states or changes that happen that are different to those described by those that find themselves in the top-down, more esoteric awareness is all teachings. So, people don't have to think, oh, that hasn't happened to me. If you find that peace of mind in daily living is happening, it means that the path is just a different path that is still taking us to the same integrated perspective of being a human, unidentified with outcomes as being a defining factor of who I am.
Oh, thank you, Roger. I got a whole mini lecture out of you. I feel sorry for the other questioners in the queue. Thank you. That was very detailed. That's a lot for me to digest. Thank you.
Yes, it is. All right. Well, thank you very much.